Welcome back, everybody, and welcome back to yet another video covering the progressive era. In this video, we're going to talk about two great movements. Well, the progressive era is full of great movements, but we're going to cover two great movements that were part of the progressive era. Number one, the movement that led to the women's right to vote, and number two, the growing civil rights movement after the end of Reconstruction would will eventually lead to the modern civil rights movement of the 1960s. Let's talk about women for a second, because women have featured pretty prominently in our entire discussion about the progressive era. In fact, women were at the forefront of the progressive era, whether it was championing child labor laws to get children out of the factories, or workplace safety, or opposing what they called the white slave traffic, or the temperance movement, which was heavily female, or the suffragette movement. Women, even though they didn't have the vote, were at the forefront of all of these great progressive movements of the era. And if we're going to talk about women and activism during the progressive era, I don't think there's a movement that, that outshines. I mean, they're all great movements, but the real main event here is the suffragette movement, the movement to win the right to vote to millions of women in this country. Now, the right to vote was not necessarily a brand new cause. It had been around for some time now. The women's rights, and by extension, the suffragette movement, actually was born in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention with the first Declaration of Women's Rights. In 1850, the first National Women's Rights Convention was founded, becoming the American Equal Rights Association in 1866, which championed both the cause of universal suffrage and the abolition of slavery. Disagreements emerged among the suffragettes at the time over the 15th Amendment, of whether it should be universal or they should just allow black men to have the vote first. And of course, the 15th Amendment gave black men the vote first, and it caused a split in the movement, creating the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869, who opposed the 15th Amendment on the grounds that it allowed for discrimination on the basis of sex. But suffrage would come gradually and eventually on a state-by-state basis. Wyoming was the first state to grant women the right to vote and hold office in 1890. As a territory, you could say it went all the way back to 1869. Colorado would follow in 1893, with Utah and Idaho in 1896. 14 years later, it's going to take 14 years later for the next state, Washington, to grant women the right to vote. By 1919, 39 states had extended some form of suffrage to women, but only 13 of those 39 actually gave women full suffrage, as in the right to vote in any and all elections. If the suffragette movement had founding mothers, then definitely we're looking at Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, that were there pretty much all the way from the beginning to the Seneca Falls Convention. They founded the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890 by merging the two main women's rights and suffrage groups. Remember, they had split just before the 15th Amendment. They brought them back together again. A couple of years later, under the leadership of Carrie Chapman Catt, who would become president of Nassau between 1900 and 1904, and again in 1915 to 1920. By 1917, under her leadership, Nassau had 2 million members. However, unsatisfied with Nassau's sole issue of women's suffrage, a younger generation of women, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, founded the more militant NWP, National Women's Party, in 1916, which advocated not just for suffrage, but for the legal protection of women's rights and the banning of all discrimination based on sex. Um, More creative than the older organization. For example, their silent sentinel protest in front of the White House from 1917 to 1919 was instrumental in pressuring Congress into finally passing the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment passed Congress on June 14th, 1919, and it was ratified into law on August 18th, 1920, finally giving women the right to vote in any and all elections. Were there folks that opposed the right for women to right to vote? Absolutely, there was. There's always an opposition. Now let's talk about civil rights. Civil rights are the constitutional rights all citizens are entitled to, with the understanding that said rights cannot be limited nor denied, and that all citizens are to be afforded the equal protection of these rights under the law, as guaranteed under the 14th Amendment. With the end of Reconstruction in 1877, states, counties, and towns throughout the South passed laws mandating racial separation and the restriction of African American civil rights. We know these as Jim Crow laws. The first well-known legal challenge to Jim Crow came in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. In 1890, Louisiana had passed a separate car law segregating all rail travel within Louisiana. The Committee of Citizens, an early civil rights group, asked Homer Plessy, who was one-eighth black and who for years had ridden in the white car, to challenge the law in 1892. He did. He was arrested. He filed suit against the state of Louisiana. 4 years later, it reached the Supreme Court in the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson case, in which the court basically returned the opinion that so long as facilities are equal, there is no violation of the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment. Therefore, separate but equal can coexist. And this is where we get the infamous separate but equal doctrine that frankly opens up the floodgates for Jim Crow laws throughout the South. Now, if I were to ask you in class, who do you recognize as the most prominent and influential voice in Black America um, during the Civil War, before and just after, you likely would have told me Frederick Douglass. And you would have been right. But like everyone, Frederick Douglass eventually passes away in 1895 and leaves a vacuum, if you will. Who will be the next person within the Black community that speaks for the Black community? In the post-Reconstruction South, the most prominent and influential voice would be that of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington himself was born into slavery in 1856, and he would emerge as a renowned educator, author, orator, and even advisor to several presidents. And he wrote a book, an autobiography, Up From Slavery. Booker T. Washington saw self-improvement as the key to social change. Very progressive. Just as he viewed education as the path forward for Southern blacks. As the founder of Tuskegee Institute in 1881, which was at first set up as a teacher's college that trained teachers who could, in return, teach farming and trade skills in schools and colleges for blacks across the South. Booker T. Washington promoted his conservative, accommodationist approach when it came to black progress in the South. Accepting Jim Crow laws and the non-existence of black political power, he called on blacks to go to school and learn a trade, self-reliance through self-improvement. He also called for blacks to adopt white dress, speech, mannerisms, and habits in order to earn greater acceptance by whites. As an advocate for black industrial education, Washington attracted a network of wealthy American philanthropists who donated to his schools, such as Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and George Eastman. One of the most famous instructors at Tuskegee for 47 years was George Washington Carver, which many people inaccurately link to this is the peanut guy and he invented peanut butter. No, 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 no. Um, he was an agricultural scientist, botanist, and inventor who promoted alternative crops to cotton, such as peanuts and sweet potatoes and soybeans. This is at a time that everybody's growing cotton once again because this is what brings in money. And sharecroppers, of course, want money because they want to get out of debt. What they don't understand is that cotton does an incredible job at depleting the soil. George Washington Carver, you could say, is going to save millions from ruin by through his assistance, through his discoveries of what to plant and why, and and what crops are going to help with soil depletion, which was caused by the repeated plantings of cotton. So he would do things like he suggested things like systemic crop rotation, companion planting, focusing on crops that would release nitrates into the soil. He was the most prominent black scientist of the early 20th century. Just since we're on the topic of Tuskegee, I want to remind everybody Tuskegee was one of several historical black colleges and universities that exist till today. I think it's like almost 200, serving the black community since the end of the Civil War. Other notable HBCUs are Spelman, Morehouse, and Clark in Atlanta, Howard, which was probably one of the first ones in DC, Xavier in New Orleans, Hampton in Virginia, Fisk in Tennessee, and even in Florida, FAMU, Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. Booker T. Washington cemented his accommodationist approach while delivering his 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition. Intended as an informal agreement between Southern blacks who would agree to submit to white political rule while tolerating segregation and discrimination, and Southern whites who would allow blacks a free basic education limited to vocational and industrial training. And here's some of the quotes from that famous Atlanta Compromise speech, and probably one of the most famous phrases: "Cast down your bucket where you are." Um, he also actually justifies segregation in that quote out there. In all things, they are purely social. We could, as separate as the finger, yet as one of the hand, in all things essential to mutual purpose. Well, at first he was praised by many blacks and whites. Eventually, others took issue with the compromise, instead believing that African Americans should engage more assertively, more aggressively in civil rights activism. One of these people that would be definitely more assertive than Booker T. Washington um, would be educator, journalist, and civil rights activist and anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells, who was perhaps the most famous black woman in America of her times. And had it not been for her times, she could have easily have been the most influential black leader in this country. But the fact that she was a woman did not help. She was actually very close to Frederick Douglass, and she organized a boycott of the Chicago World's Fair and Exposition because of their failure to include any black voices in that exposition. Originally from Memphis, Tennessee, in the 1890s, Wells began, well, she had three friends that were lynched. We should talk about lynching. Lynching was an awful phenomenon that existed in this country for Reconstruction up until the 1960s, in which mobs, for lack of a better word, would take it upon themselves to deliver extrajudicial justice. Justice is an awful word to use there. But they would actually execute almost always black individuals um, outside of the law. So, this is what got Ida B. Wells interested in researching what was going on. So in the 1890s, she documented lynching in the United States in articles and through her pamphlet called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. Wells exposed lynching as a barbaric Southern practice used to intimidate and oppress African Americans who created economic and political competition for whites. She ended up uncovering and exposing thousands of lynchings, and she would um, her findings would be recorded in both, a compilation of her articles, Southern Horrors and Other Writings, and in another book she wrote in 1895 when she moved to Chicago, because already she was getting threats in Memphis, the Red Record. She was also going to move on to be a founding member of the NAACP. We'll talk about them later. She was also a suffragette and very much a leader of the suffragette movement. There was actually an incident in 1916, I believe, in which white suffragettes wanted her and her delegation of black suffragettes to march in the back of the line, and she forced herself into the front of the line. So she was also a supporter of labor unions, knowing well that labor unions also had a problem with racism. But let's get to the man that eventually is going to supplant Booker T. Washington, provide a counter, if you will, to what Booker T. Washington was offering. William Edward Burghardt Dubois, or W.E.B. Dubois, or Dubois it should be, because he was of French ancestry. He was an American sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, Pan-Africanist, author, writer, and editor. Wrote prolifically, by the way. He was, unlike Booker T. Washington, even unlike Ida B. Wells, that was also born into slavery. Um, Dubois was born free and raised in Massachusetts. He's actually the first African American to earn a doctorate in the United States, a doctorate in sociology. He became a professor of history, sociology, and economics at Atlanta University. So, whereas Booker T. Washington was an educator and Ida B. Wells was a journalist, um, Dubois comes from the world of academia. In 1905, he had led the founding of the Niagara Movement, which is an interesting story. They tried to meet on the U.S. side of the Niagara Falls, and they couldn't get a hotel, so they met on the Canadian side. And this group was founded deliberately with the reason of countering Booker T. Washington's influence in the black community. It was a civil rights organization opposed to what its members believed were the policies of accommodation and conciliation promoted by Booker T. Washington. There's a man, I'm going to mention his name, William Trotter. He's part of the Niagara movement. He's a longtime uh, opponent of Booker T. Washington. So much of what W. Du Bois came to say, it actually comes from William Trotter earlier, who's actually in that picture as well. 4 years later, the Niagara movement becomes another more well-known group. You probably know the name, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Dubois was one of the founding members of this organization, as was um, I.D.B. Wells, and several white Americans as well. A bit more about Dubois. Dubois himself, at first a supporter of Booker T. Washington, came to accuse Booker T. Washington of enabling racism and stifling the potential of black people. Unlike Booker T. Washington, he advocated for full liberal education for blacks and the pursuit of his profession. He had this idea that, you know, at least 10% of the black community had the potential to become doctors and lawyers and engineers and whatnot, and they had a responsibility of lifting everyone else. You kind of have to understand his politics as well. Dubois, with time, becomes increasingly more left wing, if you will. Um, he becomes a socialist, which becomes very not uncommon in the progressive era, and especially among the African American community going to the 1930s, and eventually a communist when he gets to his 90s. The first wave of lynchings, going back to the topic of lynchings, the first wave of lynchings occurred in the years immediately following the Civil War, Reconstruction, nearly 2,000 lynchings during Reconstruction, but fell off sharply with the dissolution of the first Ku Klux Klan in about 1870. There was a revival in the 1890s. The largest annual number of lynchings occurred in 1892. 230 persons were lynched that year, 161 of them being African Americans, and continued for the next 2 decades with relatively high levels. The NAACP began to publish lynching statistics in their New York City office. All of this would, and Ida B. Wells' writings eventually would lead to the Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill of 1918, which was supported by the silent parades, silent protest of the NAACP. Unfortunately, Southern senators filibustered this bill. It was never given the chance of becoming law or even being voted upon in the Senate. And back to Du Bois, he was a prolific scholar. He was the author of several books which explored the Black experience in America. He was chief editor of The Crisis, which was the official magazine of the NAACP, for 24 years between 1910 and 1934. He used The Crisis, with its 100,000 member subscriber circulation, to promote his views on race relations and advocate for civil rights. He also denounced lynching, demanding a federal criminalization of lynching, promoted labor unionism despite racism of unions, promoted socialism despite the racism of some socialists, promoted women's suffrage despite the racism of suffragettes. And that's pretty much our last slide. That's where we were. That's where we were during the progressive era as far as um, civil rights in this country. There's an awakening that's emerging. Um, Booker T. Washington at first, has a particular angle, but it's going to be supplanted by the younger, more assertive Dubois. And so that's our PowerPoint for today. Pretty short.